when Martha and Darwin purchased it, there were many families that had lived here after the murders occurred. Someone enclosed the front porch and the back porch and put in plumbing and electrical. Darwin removed all that and put it back to the way that it was in 1912. It took him 2 years to do. The reason that Darwin purchased the house is because it had sat for sale for 2 years. He heard someone was going to buy it and bulldoze it. Darwin loved history. He said that is a big piece of Iowa history, so he said to Martha, his wife, the lady out in the barn, he said, I think I'm going to buy the axe murder house. Martha said, don't you dare. Well, needless to say, he didn't listen to her. But if you guys want to go grab a seat in the living room, I will give you the history, okay? Okay. That is an actual picture, though, of Joe and Sarah, the mom and dad, with Herman and Catherine, the two oldest children. And that picture there is Sarah with Herman and Catherine. Herman is the one on the right, okay? Now, the story starts out on June 9th, 1912. That was a Sunday. There was a church service here in town at the Presbyterian Church that evening. It was a service for the children, end of school year, beginning of summer. The two visiting girls that were here, their names were Lena and Ina Stillinger. Their parents lived 2 miles outside of town. They wanted to make sure they made it to that service, so they walked into town that day. Now, they had a grandmother who lived here in town. They were going to spend the night with her. Well, church did not get out until 9:30. At that point, it was dark. There were no street lamps lit in Villisca that night. The guy that would light the street lamps in Town Hall, they were having a fight. That guy said, forget you guys. I am not lighting your street lamps. Well, Grandma lived the opposite direction from the church as the Moores did. The girls were afraid to walk to Grandma's alone in the dark. So the Moores said to him, I'll just come home and spend the night with us. They phoned home, got a hold of an older sister who said, if the Moores said you can stay, go ahead and stay. So they all came home together that night. Now, all of you noticed the gray house next door, didn't you?
Yes.
That is where Mary Peckham lived. She was an older lady, and she was one of those very nosy neighbors. She knew every move that the family made, okay? Now, she had got up very early Monday morning and washed some laundry, and about 6 a.m. went out to hang it on the line. That is when she noticed that the animals here on the Moore property had not been fed, and that was unusual. The barn that sits out there today is not the barn that was here when the murders occurred. They had more land than what's here now. Their barn sat further back. This was the edge of town, nothing but fields to this side of town. Back in 1912, when the murders occurred, there were only 2 automobiles in town, and those were rentals. Most people were still using horse and buggy at that time. They had a couple horses, a cow, and some chickens. Now, Mary kept an eye on the house since the animals hadn't been fed, and by 7 o'clock, absolutely no movement from within the house. Now, that she had never seen. So at that point, she started making phone calls. She eventually got a hold of Joe's brother, Ross. She said, you need to get to your brother's house. There's something wrong. He came over, and using a key, he entered the house through this door here. Now, he immediately went into this bedroom here, and that is where he found the first 2 victims. When they found the victims that morning, they were all found laying in bed as if they were sleeping. They were not all killed in bed. The only ones that I know for sure that were killed in bed were the parents, okay? Their faces had all been covered with cloth. The cloth that covered the victims' faces, none of it had blood on it, nor was any of it stuck to any of the wounds. So whoever did that did it quite some time after the murders occurred. Joe, the father, he was the only one that was struck and killed with the sharp side of the axe. The others were bludgeoned with the other side. Some of them were hit so many times that they were beat beyond recognition. Some of them had been hit between 25 and 30 times apiece.
Jesus.
Yeah. Now, that's the way that it was in that room there. Nobody could recognize those 2 girls. Part of that reason was because it was a spur of the moment overnight between the 2 families. The other part was they had been beat very badly. The way that they were identified that Monday was later Monday morning, Mrs. Stillinger made a phone call to the operator. She said, I need you to do me a favor and ring the Moore home, Joe Moore's home. My girls spent the night there. I haven't heard a word. I'm getting worried. Operator replied to her, I cannot call there. They have all been murdered. Now, that's how they found out about their girls, and that's how they identified them. Mrs. Stillinger, at the time that the murders occurred, was 8 months pregnant. That same week, she wound up giving birth to a stillborn son. Yeah, they wound up losing 3 children that week. Now, when Ross discovered the first 2 victims, he immediately brought in the town cop. Now, the town cop was nothing more than a farmer who had taken the job just to do light town cop duties, okay, just so he could earn some extra income. He had no training whatsoever. He came over and went upstairs, and at the very top of the stairs is where he found the parents, Joe and Sarah. That was their bedroom. The room above our heads is where they found the 4 more children. The room above the attic, just keep it and hold it, and it'll kind of leave it alone.
Smarter flies.
Yeah, this is smart. I wish it would do flies. Anyway, the room above the kitchen, that's what we call the attic. That is where they think the killer or killers sit out waiting for them to come home from church that night and go to sleep. The reason they thought that is because they found cigarette butts and ashes that Monday morning in the attic, and no one in the Moore home smoked. Now, that's the only room that you guys cannot step into. The floor is becoming very weak. We don't want anybody falling through. There's a doorway in the closet upstairs between the 2 bedrooms, and the door to the attic is at the back. If you want to take pictures into it, you can open that door. You can either sit in the door and take pictures or stand in the door and take pictures. It's up to you, okay? Now, the town cop came downstairs and he said to Ross, he said, "This is too big for me to handle. We need to bring in state help." At that time, the only place to make a long-distance call here in town was at Town Hall. They were walking to Town Hall to make that call when people would stop them and ask them what's going on. Well, they'd tell them. By the time they got back here to the property, there were many, many people on the property. Some of them had entered the home. There were women in here scrubbing blood up off the floor. There were people just walking around. There was supposedly a guy that came in and took some small fragments of Joe's skull and kept them. Yeah, anyway, they chased everybody out of the house, stationed the National Guard around the house until the state could come in and do their investigation inside the house. Now, the state came in and they investigated for 2 years. During that 2 years, they spoke to many, many people. Most of the people that they spoke to, they considered suspects. Well, after 2 years, they had absolutely no one that they could file charges against. They had one man that they had suspicions about, but that was it. No evidence. That man's name was Reverend Kelly. Now, Kelly had come into town and he had told the Presbyterian minister here in town that the church had sent him in to watch. Now, Kelly was kind of a strange man. He was not an ordained minister. He just claimed to be. He had a past, not here in Villisca, but he had a past of doing things like window peeking, writing letters to teenage girls trying to convince them to pose nude for him. Basically, he was a pervert. Yeah. He was also only 5'2", weighed 125 pounds, never worked a day in his life, okay? Now, Kelly had spent the night at the home of the Presbyterian minister and his wife, and that house is just 3 blocks up the street, okay? Well, he left Villisca that Monday morning at 5:15 on the train. When he got on the train, he sat and he spoke to some passengers on the train about the murders that occurred here. Well, it took those passengers a couple weeks before they got a newspaper article with a timeline in it, but once they did, they realized that Kelly had spoke to them before the murders had been discovered. They followed the investigators. Well, Kelly was kind of a drifter, and communications back in 1912 are nothing like they are today. It took the investigators several weeks to catch up to him. But once they did, and they talked to him about what those passengers had said, Kelly's reply was, well, that wasn't the week I spoke to him. He said it was the following week or 2 weeks after that. Once the investigators got back to the people who had originally made the call, their reply was, it has been so long since this happened, we don't know if we're remembering correctly. And then you sit and think, well, what, didn't anybody write anything down?
If I had that information, I'd be writing it in my journal.
Yeah.
Dear diary,
Well,
I just had a weird conversation.
Yeah, well, not only that, but the investigators, you know, they didn't go, so-and-so called on such and such a date, so they could at least say, okay, this is the date you called in. Think back. Was it 2 weeks ago? You know, I mean, really. Yeah. So anyway, at that point, they could not charge him. Now, 4 years after the murders occurred, Kelly was in a small town here in southwest Iowa, and he said to a man in this small town, he said, the police are going to come and arrest me for the murder of the Stillinger girls, only those 2 girls. That guy in turn phoned the police. They went and they picked Kelly up. Now, they questioned him for 8.5 hours, during which time Kelly kept saying, I will confess to these murders if you promise to put me in a mental hospital because I'm very sick and I need help. They kept telling him, we can't promise you that. Well, after 8.5 hours of interrogation, Kelly looks at him and he said, well, apparently you guys think I've done this. He said, well, then I guess I must have done it. He said, fine. He said, I'll tell you what happened that night. Now, at this point in Kelly's life, I believe he is absolutely crazy. His confession is absolutely crazy. I didn't used to tell my groups what it was. I just said it was a crazy confession because it was so crazy. I thought it was just a bunch of made-up BS to make it look more dramatic until Martha got the 100th anniversary edition newspaper and it's got the confession in it. And they're the original articles that were printed when the stuff happened. I read it and I went, oh my God, he did say this stuff. And then I kind of felt stupid. Yeah. Anyway, Kelly said, the house that he was staying at that night, he said it was just too hot to sleep. It was a very hot night. He said, so about 12:30 he got up to take a walk. He said as he was walking down the street, he noticed a shadow man walking down the street, so he started following him. He said he followed him between the two houses here, and then Kelly said he watched him enter the back door into the Moore's kitchen. Kelly said as soon as the shadow man entered the kitchen, he heard him say, go further up. No. He heard him say, follow me. Kelly said that was when he himself grabbed Joe's axe, and then he himself entered the back door into the kitchen with the axe. He said as soon as he stepped into the kitchen, he heard the shadow man say, go further up. Kelly said that was when he started walking up the stairs. He said as he was walking up the stairs, he felt like he was climbing Jacob's ladder to heaven. He said as soon as he got upstairs, he heard the shadow man say, slay and slay utterly. Kelly said, that's when I started killing. Now Kelly signs his confession. As soon as he signs it, he looks at him and he said, I didn't kill these people. He said, I have no idea who killed them. Kelly was crazy. They were desperate. They took this signed confession and they filed charges against him for Lena's murder only. Now that trial went on for 2 weeks. It resulted in a hung jury. They immediately filed charges against him for Ina's murder. That trial went on for 2 days. At this point, Kelly recants his confession. He said, look, he said, I didn't kill these people. He said, my confession was coerced by the police. He said, but I just said all those things to impress my wife anyway. Yeah, Kelly was married. His wife was almost 6 feet tall. Remember, he's 5'2".
Yeah. 125 pounds.
Yeah. Anyway, that trial resulted in a not guilty. They wound up letting him go. The last anybody heard anything from Reverend Kelly, he was in a mental hospital back in New York State. Okay. Now, 2 years after the murders occurred, the victims' families had grown real irritated that no one had been charged. They hired themselves a private investigator. That man's name was Wilkerson. He came up from a firm in Kansas City. Now there was a difference between Wilkerson and the state investigators, and that difference is that Wilkerson would actually talk to the women and take their statements. State guys talked to the women, they didn't take any statements, and they didn't much pay attention to what they had to say. It was early 1900s, they were women, it didn't make any difference what they said. Well, after Wilkerson investigated for quite some time, he realized that he had gathered witness statements to implicate a man here in town by the name of Frank Jones. That Frank had hired a man by the name of Blackie Mansfield to kill Joe. Frank was a very rich and powerful man here in town. He had been a state senator. He was also a bank president. He also owned a business here in town that Joe Moore had worked at for 8.5 years. Until 3 years before the murders occurred, John Deere came into town. They went to Frank, asked him to carry their implements at his business here in town where Joe worked. Frank said, no thank you, I'm not interested, I already have a line that I carry there. So at that point, they went to his #1 salesman and asked him if he would like his own implement dealership. Joe said of course. They set him up downtown, cat-a-corner from the Jones store. They looked at competition of business as a possible motive for the murders. Also back in 1912, there was a rumor going around town, and that was that Joe Moore was having an affair with Frank Jones's daughter-in-law. They looked at that as a motive also. Now, Blackie Mansfield, he was in town back in 1912 because they were putting in the paving bricks in the streets of Villisca. They have what they call transient laborers helping do that job. They all lived in a tent colony down by the river, which is just a quarter mile this way. Now, on the Saturday night before the murders occurred on Sunday night, there were witnesses who had seen Blackie Mansfield down by the river talking to Frank Jones and his son. There was also a witness who on that same night had heard a man say to someone in an abandoned building down in that area, heard this man say, "I want him dead." Private investigator took all these witness statements to the county attorney. He looked him over. He said there was enough for a grand jury for these two men. He started putting one together. Well, state attorney came running into the county. He probably came into the county probably because Frank called him and said help. Because he said, "I will conduct this grand jury." State guy promptly put all Frank Jones's buddies on the grand jury that he could get. So consequently, neither man was indicted or had any charges filed against them. Now, right after the grand jury was over, Frank filed a slander lawsuit against the victims' families and the private investigators, saying they've all been going around telling lies that I hired Blackie to kill Joe. Frank lost that lawsuit, but they couldn't do anything to either man because of the grand jury. Now, Blackie Mansfield, years after the murders occurred here, he had gotten married. He had a 4-month-old daughter. He had abandoned his wife and daughter. They lived with her parents in Blue Island, Illinois. All 4 of them were found murdered in the parents' home, and the crime scene was identical to this crime scene.
Plural.
Blackie was arrested for the murder of his family. They tried to talk to him about here. He said, "Don't bother." He was convicted of murdering his family. They asked him why he did it. His response was, "I just didn't like them very much." Yeah. Anyways, there's another suspect that some people think had something to do with it, and that man's name was Henry Lee Moore. He was no relationship to the Moores here. He was from Columbia, Missouri. Back in 1909 into 1912, there were murders that occurred in Colorado, Kansas, Iowa, Illinois. They all occurred on Sunday nights. They all occurred near the railroad tracks, and the crime scenes were all somewhat similar. They thought they had a serial killer riding the rails. Well, after the murders occurred here, Henry Lee was convicted of murdering his mother and his grandmother with an axe. At his sentencing hearing, the judge asked him, "Is there any reason why you should not be convicted of the murders that occurred in Colorado, Kansas, and so on?" Henry Lee's only response was to hang his head. So people looked at that as an admission of guilt. That's kind of it in a nutshell, but I forgot to tell you when I said the crime scenes here and at Blackie's family's house, the similarities were that the person that committed the murders at both places stripped down naked, committed the murders. When he got done, he sat down in the kitchen with a tub of water, washed the blood from his body before he got dressed. Before he left, he sat down at the kitchen table with food that he had pulled out of the pantry and ate. All the victims' faces had been covered, all the mirrors had been covered. You know, so and that's kind of it in a nutshell.